I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to a very special episode of Postcards from a Dying World. This one is a big one for me. Stanley Wiater is the author of Dark Dreamers. If I had not bought this book when it came out in 1990, we might not be listening to this conversation together. I wouldn't have a shelf of horror novels sitting over there that I wrote myself. I don't think I would have taken this path had I not read Dark Dreamers and Dark Visions. So Stanley's done a lot of work, but these two books are part of what I would really want to talk about today because they were a huge influence on me, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But he's also the author of books on Stephen King, Richard Matheson, and many others. One of the great researchers of the field of horror. And, I do cover a little bit more science fiction around these parts than I do horror, but, horror is one of my loves. And this year horror is really important because we're hosting StokerCon here in San Diego this year. So I'm getting real jazzed up and excited for that. Welcome to the podcast, Stanley. It is an honor to have you here.
Thank you, David. It's an honor that I ruined your life.
Yeah, well, that's true. It is your fault. So what I want to do a little bit here is I gotta get this out of the way and ask you the question that Norman Spinrad called me stupid for asking him. But how did you get into genre fiction? Like, how did this happen for you? Because I feel like we need this baseline to start this conversation. So, I have to ask it. Like, where was your original love for horror and science fiction and the fantastique? Where did that start?
Well, I'm going to name drop an obscure writer. His name is Stephen King.
Yeah, that
And
guy.
he once famously said, when people asked him that same stupid question, he said, "What makes you think I had a choice?"
Right. Right.
I
It
had
just
no
happened.
choice.
Yeah.
I loved horror, fantasy, science fiction. One of the first authors I ever read was Edgar Rice Burroughs,
Right.
H.P. Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, the good old boys from Weird Tales, discovering them in beat up paperbacks and used bookstores in a small rural town called Hadley, Massachusetts.
Mm.
Now, Hadley, Massachusetts is a small town, but it just happens to be bordered by Amherst and Northampton,
Mm.
Massachusetts, which happen to have Amherst College, Mount Holyoke College, University of Massachusetts, Smith College, Mount Holyoke College, just a few minor colleges surround Hadley. And of course, the used bookstores there were just overflowing with
Mm.
fantasy, science fiction, and horror. So from a very early age, I didn't need no damn library. I just had to go to the used bookstores and get The Land That Time Forgot for 10 cents with a Frank Frazetta cover, or an H.P. Lovecraft The Color Out of Space for 25 cents in a used paperback edition. So since I was a precocious reader from, I would say, age 8 and upwards, I already had my feast waiting to be devoured.
Well, and at my age, I already, because I come in the generation that's post Stephen King. So, like, of course, Stephen King was a huge part of, like, you know, my introduction to the genre and the idea of writers being human beings. But really, for me, and I've said this before, but I already knew who Stephen King was, but it was really seeing Richard Matheson books in a used bookstore and recognizing his name from the credits on Star Trek and the Twilight Zone and going, oh, wait, this guy wrote books too.
Yes.
And I recognize that name, and he's a guy. And somebody had to write these. Now, I didn't really connect the fact that he only wrote one Star Trek, but I knew he wrote a lot of Twilight Zones. So Richard Matheson was really important to me in that regard. But I'm sure like there were certain authors when you were growing up that like their names kept appearing. And is that how you got interest in?
Yes, it was Ray Bradbury, and this is, of course, these are all common knowledge to at least certainly coming from my generation who
Yeah.
grew up reading paperbacks from the 1950s and early 60s. It was Ray Bradbury's The October Country, Charles
Oh,
Bone,
okay.
The
Yeah.
Magic Man,
That was
Robert
the that was the
Blunt's,
magic that was the magic one. No,
yeah,
no,
any of those.
yeah, you became a researcher. You became somebody who wrote about the field. Like, how early were you interested in the people behind it, or was did that come eventually? Because you know,
It came to one book, David, and it's
yeah,
always that way. It's either one author or one book. It was a
right.
book called Seekers of Tomorrow by
Mm,
Sam Moskowitz. Came out in the late 60s or early 70s, I believe late 60s. It was a collection of profiles of famous science fiction writers
I'm
and a
writing
few
that
horror.
down.
Oh, you got to get it. I mean, Moskowitz was a brilliant researcher. He was one of the very first researchers. He also did one of the very first biographies of Edgar Rice Burroughs. I was a total Edgar Rice Burroughs nut and Robert E. Howard nut when I was a kid, and by kid I mean about 10 years old, 10 to 12 years old. So finding finding the Seekers of Tomorrow, that became my Bible because it was it was profiles which I had never seen before of Edmund Hamilton, of Ray Bradbury, of
Mhm.
Lester Del Rey, and I just sat there and I said, you know, I want to read about Ray Bradbury's because of October Country, but what kind of mind comes up with the stories that, became the book, The October Country? So I started looking into the behind the scenes, and this was again pre-internet. This is why I have to kind of like educate the younger folks by saying, there was a time there was no internet, there
Right.
was no Google machine. You just had to go to the damn library or own 1,000 books as a kid to find out who these writers were and what was about them. And with the exception of Edgar Rice Burroughs, none of these writers had biographies written about them at the time back in the 50s and 60s.
Hmm. And like little tidbits that are kind of things that we all know, like that Ray Bradbury performed the wedding for Edmund Hamilton and Lee Brackett. Like these types of things, like you can read that on Wikipedia now, but back
Yes.
then, like this is a thing that you're just you know like facts and like about how these people interacted, how they taught each other, how they worked together. Like you just didn't know that. They were just names on the spine of the book.
Yeah, Lee Brackett was Ray Bradbury's mentor. There'd be no Ray Bradbury if
With
it
it,
wasn't for Lee Brackett.
that is very important piece of history too.
Yeah.
And speaking as a Lee Brackett fan, I think that's something that should be remembered. And I learned from going to the Ray Bradbury Center in Indianapolis, which is, it's interesting that's in Indianapolis, but that's the one of the leading authorities on Ray Bradbury taught at IUPUI, and that's why it's there. But they recreated his entire office. They moved everything from LA, and it's in a basement in Indiana now. And I grew up in Indiana, so that's one of the reasons why when I was back home. But they had there the copy of the original draft of The Empire Strikes Back that Lee Brackett had been keeping Ray Bradbury in the know on because she was afraid that if she died before she finished it, she had asked Ray to help finish it.
Yeah.
And like little things like that, it's just amazing. Like, I love research and I'm just nerding out on the idea of
Well, that's
research.
all right. No, no, Ray Bradbury's office. I did my first, what I call my dark dreamers interviews, when I coined the term dark
Uh-huh.
dreamers. My first interview professional was with Ray Bradbury, which was done on August 7th of 1974, and we
Wow.
did it in his office. And I'd been through his house, and I spent the entire evening in his house. And his wife had to kick me out because
I'm
I
sure she
refused
did.
to leave. I had the tape recorder on, and I had tape after tape after tape. I worshiped this man, and I
Yes.
had met him at Warner Brothers. I was there on a scholarship to study in the summer of '74, and at that time, Sam Peckinpah was going to direct Something Wicked This Way Comes. And there had
Mm.
been a private screening of Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia.
Wow.
And
Which is my
Bradbury
favorite
was,
Peck and Paw movie, by
and
the
I
way.
went up to Bradbury and I said, "Excuse me, Mr. Bradbury, I just happen to be your #1 fan. Can I interview you? I'm just a lowly college student, but I will cut my wrist if you refuse me this honor." And he said, "Sure, kid, come on to my house. Just give me a call." He gave me his number, and I got a taxi and got dropped off. And as I say, I did not leave his house until the wife says, "Ray, come to bed. It's past your bedtime." And
That's great.
that was my
So he was
first
the
official Dark Dreamers interview.
okay. Now, at that time, were you already thinking of it as being a book eventually, or were you not thinking that far ahead yet?
David, I'm not hearing you again.
I'm sorry. Were you already thinking of that as a book, or did you lose my sound? Hold on, let me pause.
David, no.
Sorry, we had a little technical difficulty, but so did you always have it planned as a book or when you did that first interview with Ray Bradbury, or was that just like I got an excuse to talk to Ray Bradbury and the book came eventually later?
Well, even though I was in college, it was my junior year in college that I got the scholarship. I was one of 5 people who wrote an essay and won a scholarship to study at Warner Brothers for the summer of
Hmm.
'74. And that's a long story, and we'll get to it at another time. But I was still in college at the University of Massachusetts, and foolishly, I decided to go back and finish out my college education rather than doing the smart thing, which would have been stay in Los Angeles and get a job at Warner Brothers, even
Right.
if it was in the mailroom. But be that as it may, I went back, and when I graduated college, I got a job as a freelance newspaper stringer. So I was an entertainment reporter for a weekly arts newspaper, and I took the interviews that I did because I did a few dozen interviews while I was out in California, knowing that this is money to
Mm.
be made by doing the interviews. Uh, One someday I'll tell you the story how I interviewed David Carradine on the
Well,
set of Kung Fu,
I
and we
mean,
both
you
got
feel free, like
well, we both got stoned together. He was stoned constantly. He smoked cigar size reefer every day on the set. And so when we agreed to be interviewed, we went back to his trailer, and I smoked my first cigar size joint, and I left my tape recorder behind. I left my mind behind, and I still got an article out of it, even though I didn't have the actual tape with me. But
no,
going back, I'm sorry, go ahead.
no. So a lot of these interviews that you did for these books, you were able to sell along the way to outlets like Fangoria and Twilight Zone the magazine and things like that. And a lot of people don't know like just how amazing, like for example, Twilight Zone the magazine was during that era. It was one of the few
Had
places.
every issue. I was in it quite regularly.
Yeah.
Uh, I made a living. I was brought up on a uh, lower middle class upbringing, but the point was I knew I was going to be a journalist. I knew I was going to be a researcher. I knew I was going to be a writer from an early age. And I sold my first article at age 16 to Fate magazine. So
Mm.
this was in high school at age 16. So I knew at a tender age that I was going to make a living at it. So how do you make a living at it? Well, you interview famous people and you sell it to the newspapers, and you sell another part of that interview to another newspaper. Then you sell it to a magazine. Then after you sell it to a magazine, you say, "Hey, I think I've got enough interviews to put them out in a book." Then you get an agent. Then you get an agent to get you the best deal because you got the biggest names in the industry of the horror and fantasy and science fiction, and you get a nice, 5 to 6 figure advance for the two books, Dark Dreamers, Dark Visions, which had all been repeatedly sold to the various outlets.
Mhm.
So I was smart enough to say, if I'm going to make a living at this, I've got to squeeze out every nickel from every person who's ever been kind enough to talk to me over the years.
Now, and I want to explain to people and to you a little bit. Now, I shared with you over email and messenger and stuff like how important these books were to me. But and for the hilarious reason, one of the hilarious reasons which we'll get to, and anyone who's watching the YouTube version of this can see how beaten and read and loved my Dark Dreamers is. And so for me as a person who wanted to tell stories, who loved horror fiction, like in the back of my head, I wanted to be a writer. At the time, I felt very challenged by the fact that I was dyslexic. Well, I am dyslexic and I had to overcome that. But one of the things that kept me like interested was and just made me go, oh, this is a career. People do this. Was reading Dark Dreamers and the sequel about horror film, Dark Visions, and 2 years later. But right when this came out, I got a copy at Morgenstern Books in my hometown, Bloomington, Indiana, which is back. That store was gone for a while, but they're back. And like reading these interviews were so foundational for me because they were inspiring because it was about storytelling and it was about creation and it was about all these things and it was all these people who like I read some of the like Robert McCammon or Dennis Etchison were people whose books I'd read, but because I'd heard interviews with Stephen King and Richard Matheson, the big names. But the more obscure names in there that were in here, and we'll talk a little bit about all the different people that are in here in a little bit. But for example, like a big one for me was John Ferris, because I read a lot of John Ferris, but there was precious to little no information
Yeah.
about John Ferris. And I loved The Fury, and I loved The X-Men Cometh, and I loved Son of the Endless Night. And there wasn't anything out there about that guy. So, and I'm gonna let you talk in a minute, and I'm just going through a lot of this for my listeners. But I literally for years, because Dark Dreamers is a book that you could just pick up and read any little part, I kept it on my toilet
And
because
that's the ultimate honor. You know that for an author, people are going to laugh at us, but the
yeah,
ultimate author compliment to an author is you say, by the way, I have you as a bathroom reader, one of your
yeah.
works.
Instead of
Okay.
magazines, I kept Dark Dreamers and Dark Visions in my bathroom. So when I sat down and I knew I was going to be there for a minute or two, I could open to any page. And that was one of the things that I did. I didn't look, like maybe today I opened to Graham Masterton. Maybe today I opened to James Herbert or Charles Grant. And it was like, it was constantly inspiration to keep trying, to keep thinking about these things. And so for years, I read and reread parts of these books, and there are things I quote from here from these interviews all the time, unconsciously and consciously, and a lot of what I know about genre comes from here. So I just want to give people that background of why this is so important to me. Now, let's get into some of the names that are here. Clive Barker, Robert Bloch, Gary Brandener, Charles L. Grant. I'm just, you know, bouncing around a bit. Matheson, Lehman, McCammon, Anne Rice, Whitley Strieber, Skip Inspector, J.N. Williamson, which for Indiana folks, like he was one of ours. You know, like what was the process of finding all these people? How did you choose them? And what was your process heading? Well, I'm getting a bunch of questions. Let's start with how you picked people for this process.
Well, first of all, I read their books. Being hooked on horror, for lack of a better phrase, it was very easy to read Richard Matheson because Richard Matheson was a big influence on me. When I found in the bookstore his book called Shock! Exclamation point.
Mm,
If you remember the original edition, it had a spoon on the cover, and the spoon and the face of the spoon was an open, screaming mouth, kind of like prototype J.K. Potter illustration. And I
right.
saw that cover with the screaming spoon and the title Shock. And I said, what the hell is this? And of course, then I looked at it and I said, wait a minute, that story, that's a Twilight Zone episode. And I think that's the same that you had. And I'm
Yeah.
sure a lot of other people said, never heard of Richard Matheson before, but I've seen that Twilight Zone episode, and here's the original story that it was based upon. So I had to seek out Richard Matheson, and ultimately, I actually did edited his collected stories. I did the Richard Matheson Companion.
Mm.
Um, you
And
got
we
to
did, and we did a whole tribute episode to Richard Matheson on this podcast a couple years ago with David Scow, and John Scolari, who's a I Am Legend collector, and Greg Cox, who was his last editor.
yes.
Yeah. And so people can find that back here. If you want more, if you want a lot of Richard Matheson nerding out, that panel back there is, I highly recommend. But go ahead. So
Yeah.
Matheson's one of these ones you start, but did you make a list initially, or did it just start happening like
It
after
just
that
started
record?
happening mostly because of the fact of, and I say thank God for this, the World Fantasy Convention and the World Horror Convention back in the
Mm,
80s. That's when they started up. And these were, when I say convention, they really should be called conferences
yeah.
because these were done for professionals. These weren't the, how should I put it, the fan gatherings
Yeah.
that you think of when you hear the term convention. These were conferences where you had panels and you had uh, Richard Matheson on a panel, Robert Bloch on a panel, Ray Bradbury on a panel discussing their lives and career. And I would go to these conventions slash conferences, and I was a working professional, as I mentioned earlier, as a newspaper writer.
Mm,
And so I was on assignment. So here again, I was getting paid to do the interviews from the get-go. I already had a market knowing that I could go to the conference and write an article on the World Horror Convention in Providence, Rhode Island, and get to write about Ray Bradbury and Richard Matheson and Robert Bloch and H. Warner Munn and Joseph Payne Brennan and Kirby McCauley, who was the premier agent slash editor at the time. And so I was getting paid to interview these people, and I had already read these people, and I was already in love with these people, and I was already having my own stumbling attempts to be a fiction writer as well. So I was like, what's not to like? This is like a kid going into the candy store and saying, not only do I get to eat all the candy I want, I get to go meet the guys making the damn candy.
right. And some of them, like the interview with Robert Bloch, for example, like we lost him, not too far after that. So, and we do have his autobiography, which is great.
Yeah.
That's, I think, some of the coolest anecdote for me from his biography is that he was on the double date with Kuttner and CL Moore on there. It didn't work out as well for him on his side, but oh, we lost. Okay, we got you. So yeah, so but Block, like him, like interviewing him, like it you know did you feel a certain amount of weight knowing with some of the older writers that you were?
No,
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 you
it
didn't
was
feel that at the
it
time.
was all worship, admiration, just worshiping at their feet. One of my great thrills in my lifetime is that I took Block out to lunch, not once, but twice, two different World Horror Conventions or World Fantasy, as the case may be. I got to take him out to lunch.
Yeah,
And just for me to, to say that you say is like going out to dinner with Stephen King, which I've done,
yeah,
or spending the evening at Ray Bradbury's house, which I've done.
yeah.
These are things that when I mention it on the internet, people look at me and say, "Oh my God, I've got a copy of a book signed by Robert Bloch, and you took Robert fucking Bloch out to lunch, and you
So
got to call him your
do you
friend."
have a favorite moment? Would that be the Bradbury in the office, or do you have one?
Probably that like I say, that was the first. That's when I knew, when I sat there and basically I had my tape recorder and my drool cup. So
Mhm.
while the tape recorder was going, I was drooling into my cup, saying, "I don't know what to ask you, Mr. Bradbury. Just spill your guts. Just talk. Just talk to me. I'm your number one fan. Please, anything. Your book, The October Country, changed my life. Please educate me because I want to be a fiction writer myself someday." So by the time I got to meet folks like Stephen King and Peter Straub, they were like older brothers. They weren't
Yeah.
people when you talk about different generations. For my generation, Stephen King is like 5 years older than me, so it wasn't like I'm sitting down here and Stephen King's this great guy. Stephen King's the guy who bought me drinks when he was drinking. You know,
Yeah.
Stephen King was the guy when somebody was on an elevator and they had a box full of books and the box was an empty beer box. And King said in the elevator, that box was more valuable when it had the beer in it rather than the books.
Well,
You know,
yeah, for me, meeting Richard Matheson, I met him 3 times at signings and things. Was the only time I've ever been tongue tied or starstruck meeting an author, because for the most part, Clive Barker a little bit, because Clive Barker was foundational for me growing up, but I had a specific experience that kept me from getting starstruck about Clive Barker. But Matheson, it was a big deal. And there was one of the 3 times I met Matheson, I was at a screenwriting conference, and I had made friends with horror writer Owl Going Back, who I did not know. Like, we just made friends because we just happened to be sitting in the audience near each other and recognized each other as horror writers and started talking. And Owl was there with Harlan Ellison. And so after Matheson spoke at this conference, somehow I ended up in a hallway with Matheson and Ellison, Harlan Ellison, giving each other shit, basically, and a hard time. And I felt so like, that was just a moment where I was like, pinch me. Like, I can't believe
I'm dreaming.
I'm in this hallway with Richard Matheson telling Harlan Ellison to shut the fuck up, like, and oh, Harlan, shut the fuck up. And I was just like, oh my God, I just saw Richard Matheson tell Harlan Ellison to shut up. And which very few people have the cojones to do, um, being Harlan who he was. But
Yeah.
anyways, so your experience doing all these interviews, I mean, it just had to be, and I want to stick with Dark Dreamers for a little bit, because and some of these are like early in the career. Like, this is pretty early in the career for Richard Matt, or for Robert McCammon, for example,
Or
right?
Joe Lansdale.
Or Joe Lansdale, very early in his career. And I admit, your book is how I heard of Joe Lansdale and went out and got the drive-in, because I had never heard of him before. And I'm not sure if I'd heard of McCammon before or not, but and of all, like, a lot of these authors, to me, Robert McCammon is one of the most consistent.
Yeah.
Um, like, I just think he's a fantastic writer. And so for me, even going back now and looking at, like, because I can read when he's an elder statesman and I can read interviews with him, but seeing him in that early stage is actually really important. So it's like you're catching lightning in a bottle with a lot of these guys, right? And so some of these younger writers, did you foresee, like, right away, like, oh, this writer has it, like,
Oh, I knew with Joe Lansdale, and Joe's been kind enough over the years to say that the Fangoria interview put him on the map.
yeah,
The other one was Jack Ketchum.
yeah,
Uh, I met him for the first time in an elevator. A lot of elevator meets in my
yeah,
career, and I saw his name tag, Jack Ketchum, and I had just reviewed his book Off Season, his first novel for Fangoria, and gave it like a 10-star review saying this guy's a genius. You got to read off season. So I met him in the elevator and I said, catch him. He says, what? I says, you know, I made your career. And he recognized my name, Stanley Wiater. And he said, son of a bitch, you did make my career. And we became instant friends after that. And the same with Joe when I got to meet him in person at, again, a World Horror or a World Fantasy convention where Joe was kind enough to say, Stanley, nobody knew who the hell Joe Lansdale was until you did that multi-book article on me for Fangoria and
Yeah.
interview.
Well, and I mean these interviews, I mean, and some of them too, like David Morrell, for example, like because I love David Morrell, and he didn't write a ton of horror, although his horror short stories were great.
Great.
Um,
Oh yeah.
yeah, I think there's one that he wrote. It's so simple, but The Storm, um, it's so simple, but it would make such a great Masters of Horror if somebody like wanted to adapt it into a short. Um, but David Morrell, like talking about like his son and reading Tommyknockers in there, like that one stuck with me for many, many years because like whenever people when I say I subconsciously quote things, a lot of it comes back to that David Morrell talking about like how horror can be an escape from like these like horrible situations. Like I think of that David Morrell quote all the time. And I actually had a conversation with him about it at StokerCon in 2000, I think 5. And because I think David Morrell is a very underrated writer. Even though he was a bestseller and he's well rated, I think he could have been rated even better.
Yes.
And
Agreed.
yeah, and but you know, in like some of these voices, like Charles L. Grant, for example, you know, who we lost, like you know, far too early, and Richard Lehman, and so you know, like I think of those two interviews as being ones that are really important documents of like you know because in the 80s you saw their names on paperbacks like all the time
Everywhere.
everywhere.
Every newsstand, every airport, everywhere their books were around.
Yeah, and Charles L. Grant, well, Layman, I think, is still remembered to a degree by a lot of the extreme horror people, but you know, and Charles L. Grant also wrote science fiction, and but Charles L. Grant's like a name that I feel like is kind of slipping away, and so I think you know some of the importance of because like you know not just the novels that he wrote but the collections that he edited were fantastic and very
The
important.
Shadows series, yeah, for one, his
Yeah,
most famous. Yeah.
so I
Quiet
think
Heart.
I think that that's like a huge thing that this book does, and you were able to, and we'll get into this in a little bit because but I want to talk about Dark Visions first, but eventually you were able to do a TV series of this, and we will get to that. We will talk about that.
I'm here all week.
Yeah, but uh, shortly after that, you do Dark Visions, and this is a whole different ballgame because getting it's easy to get horror writers at the horror writer at the World Horror Convention because they're all going to be there for the most part, a lot of them. But tracking down the filmmakers who are often on set or often, you know, and there is crossover because obviously you did Clive Barker in both, but getting a Wes Craven or a Roger Corman or Stuart Gordon, like Vincent Price was a big, you know,
Oh wow.
yeah,
Spent the day with Vincent Price. That's something you remember for the rest of your life.
yeah,
Trust me.
and I was surprised to see old Bill Nolan in Dark Visions and not Dark Dreamers when I was reviewing it a couple days, but I know he did a lot of screenwriting and
Yes.
when I lived up in Portland, I spent quite a bit of time with Bill. So and I'm not gonna imitate Bill because I've been told I do a really good Bill, but I don't want to. But you know, seeing some of these names in here, like it's Dark Visions had to have been a little bit harder organizing, or am I wrong about that? Like, because you did, then again, you did have the power of this being on the shelves already, right?
Yes, that is true. It was easy to send it to their office, send the book to their office, or just simply name drop to say, you know, the Dark Dreamers is out there. I've interviewed Stephen King, Peter Straub, Richard Matheson. Of course, Richard Matheson being who he is, that opened a lot of doors to get to know uh, other people. And as I say, as a working journalist for newspapers, arts newspapers in Western Massachusetts back in the 80s and 90s, I had the how should I put it, a ready market for the interviews. So it was like I was so fortunate that my editor said, "Well, we don't read horror, but everybody else seems to be reading horror or going to horror movies. Stanley, here's your assignment. Go interview Wes Craven, and we'll pay you to publish it."
And so were you having to like jump on planes and go to film sets for a lot of these?
For
Because, you know,
some, yes, for some of them, yes. I would go out to Los Angeles. I had friends out in LA. I had some family out in Los Angeles. So again, a joyful job, as I would put it, to have to say, well, I've got to go out to the West Coast. Plus, as I say, when I won that scholarship to work at Warner Brothers or study at Warner Brothers as a college undergraduate to go out and meet Ray Bradbury, that was a life-changing event. I mean, I've just been blessed by having so many situations of being at the right place at the right time, and not to wax nostalgic, but the 80s and the 90s, if you were in the horror business, you were golden, baby. You know,
yeah,
every publisher, every studio said, you know, we want to make a Wes Craven film. We want to publish a Stephen King novel. Uh,
yeah.
and I was the guy, for better or worse. There was, I always tell people when they say, I've heard of Stanley Wiater, and I said, do you know why you've heard of Stanley Wiater? Because there was nobody else doing it but Stanley Wiater. And
That's right.
there were a
So,
couple guys, but nobody was putting it in books like Dark Dreamers and Dark Visions.
so what was it like interviewing Vincent Price? Where did you, was that
He
in
actually
LA? Did you go to
he
visit?
came out to the University of Massachusetts to do a performance, a one-man performance. The Villains Still Pursue Me. So it was an evening with Vincent Price, and during that same day when I spent time with him, he was talking to various acting classes and theater classes at UMass, as we called it, and that's when I got to spend time with him and do the interview. But you know, growing up, this is where I know you appreciate it. Growing up as a kid in rural Massachusetts and going to the movie theaters, the Calvin Theater in Northampton, and seeing House of Usher or The Pit and the Pendulum. And by the way, those movies, they starred Vincent Price. They were written by
By
Richard
Richard
Matheson.
Matheson. That's
And
right.
guess
Yeah.
what? They were directed by Roger
Roger
Corman.
Corman.
I mean, this was a kid who at age 10, 12, 13, 14 said, I don't know if I'm alive or dead. I just know I'm in heaven. I'm in horror heaven. And to actually go on a few years later and say, this is my destiny. You know, I am the guy who is destined to write these books. And you notice the books are not called interview books. They're
Yeah.
called conversation.
Conversations. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
made a point with my publishers to say, don't call them collections of interviews. I say these are conversations with the masters, because that's how I looked at it. And I would tell the guy, you know, I'm not just some reporter off the street who for one day has to interview Vincent Price. I've seen every horror movie Vincent Price ever made. I'm not a guy who has to, oh, for one day has to go and interview Stephen King. At
Yeah.
that time, I had read every Stephen King novel and short story that was out there and loved the genre. So when I interviewed these people, they knew they had met, in a sense, a soulmate.
All right.
It was
So now, and one thing too is that it's always been obvious to me that Stephen King wasn't in here. And I know you could have gotten Stephen King. And I always appreciated that. I was like, I got enough interviews with Stephen King. They're all over the place. and it was more important for me to hear from these other authors. But was that intentional in that way? Because I kind of appreciated that back in the day, you know,
Well,
like
Stephen King is in Dark Dreamers with Peter Straub.
that's true.
You
That's
know,
true. But he doesn't have his own chat. That yeah, and I think of it that way, I guess. But he wasn't in Dark Visions. He only did the one movie, right?
right,
So yeah.
right. No, I'm the only journalist who ever interviewed Stephen King and Peter Straub 3 times in a row, and
Mm.
I mean by that 3 annual interviews.
That's yeah, okay. Yeah, that's true. I always, it's funny because I think of that interview as them together. I don't think of it because it's so different from each of them doing an interview on their own, like
Yeah.
that conversation. And that is part of it. And so, because for me, like at what I would, and the reason why I say that is because at the time, like it would have been so easy to make Stephen King the anchor of the book and like 30% of the book and then a little bit with other people, but it wasn't that. Um, I would like to do a lightning round where we go through some of the names and you tell me a little bit about interviewing all these people. And I'm going to go back and forth from the two books. Like, you know, 30 seconds on everybody.
Okay.
Um, 30 seconds to a minute. If it's a really good story, keep going. Obviously Clive Barker you did in both books. What was your what was it like doing Clive at that
Plus
point?
the TV series Dark
Yeah.
Dreamers. He was the first episode of Dark Dreamers, and we went to his house in Beverly Hills. And when I say his house, of course, I mean a mansion.
Yeah.
And of course, when I say a mansion, he had one mansion that he lived in, and across the street, he had another mansion that he would do his artwork and writing in. So the
Yeah.
guy was suffering, and I figured he needed the publicity, so I put him in both books.
Right. And but I mean, it was amazing experience. I'm sure he was at the height of his powers, really,
Yes.
at 90.
And he
Yeah.
was just starting to do his artwork. And at that time, he had leased, believe it or not, he had not sold his artwork to Disney. He had leased the images
Yeah.
to Disney for if they ever wanted to use it for a theme park or a haunted mansion type scenario. He had sold the rights for the horrific images and macabre images to Walt Disney Company for several $1 million.
Yeah.
And most people are not aware of that.
Yeah. I've actually heard him talk about that. Yeah, about when he had the pitch meeting, they all came to his mansion with that. Yeah, that's interesting. Um, so how about Roger Corman?
Roger Corman has been probably interviewed 1,000 times, and I don't think I'm exaggerating by much. When I interviewed Roger, which was over the phone, because we missed meetings. We were supposed to interview him for the TV show, but our wires did not cross. But when I interviewed him over the phone, he gave the fastest responses to anybody I've ever interviewed in my life. It was like no matter what the question, you knew in your heart Roger had been asked this 500 times before. So even though I thought it was a pretty good interview, I don't hold it out as one of my best because there was nothing I could ask Roger that he said, Stanley, this is how I feel about this. And Stanley, this is what I think about that. Because that every journalist for the last 50 years has been asking those questions of Roger Corman. But super sweet guy, and the guy's still with us. He's in his 90s now, I believe,
Yeah.
and Roger he's still sharp as a tack and still got his act together.
Gary Brandener,
Gary Bradner was
the author
he
of The
was funny.
Howling.
He was Gary in parentheses the Howling Bradner
Yeah.
because there's a man named Robert in parentheses Psycho Block. And every time you see Robert Block's name in a marketing ploy for a book, they always have to mention his middle name, which is Psycho, in quotes. With Gary Bradner, because of the success of The Howling, every book he wrote post The Howling, they mentioned by Gary the Howling Brandner. And he thought it was a hoot because he did have some success in Hollywood with the movie The Howling, and was also involved with Howling 2, Your Werewolf. Your Sister is a Werewolf, I think is the subtitle for it, which has got to be one of the most god awful horror movies ever made. But his name is still attached to
it. John Carpenter.
John Carpenter was great. I met him in his office, and very laid back, very California. You said he was just like California, to me, a California director personified, if there is such a thing, and just seemed to take his fame in stride. Very very low key, smoking. I remember him smoking, one of the few people who probably will die with a cigarette in his mouth if he hasn't stopped. Hopefully, stopped smoking already. But just a very kind person. One thing I have to say about horror people in general, they are kind, and they know a lot of people consider them outsiders and basically beneath other kind of creative people. Something about horror, even science fiction, I feel is regarded more highly by the mainstream uh, critics and populace at large, because horror is kind of like, well, if you can't really write something, you write something that's scary. If you can't write something that's important, write something that's frightening. And these people know that a lot of people look down at them, down their noses at them, and for a reporter to come in and say, by the way, what you do is fucking important, and by the way, I worship you, and I am so proud that you're spending your time with me. And it kind of made the conversation go well after that.
Yeah, I had the same experience with Norman Spinrad. So John Ferris.
Excuse me, give me one moment.
Oh yeah. I like I said, the John Ferris interview was really important for me because he was just somebody that I didn't know much about other than I read a lot of his books. So that was a big one. What was your experience with John Ferris?
John was one of the few interviews I did over the phone. I never had the unfortunate opportunity to meet with him. He did not go to conventions. To make a long story very short, he did not go to conventions, so I never had the chance to meet with him directly. Thank God he's still with us, and obviously his books will outlive him. And like I say, a very pleasant person to talk to.
Charles L. Grant.
Charles L. Grant would often go to the conventions. I think he went to all the conventions. There was a convention that still exists to this day called Nikon, which is held in Rhode Island every year. And they just reached their 40th or 42nd convention. And I went to like the first 30 of those before I more or less retired from the writing game. And Charles Grant was a former Vietnam medic, if I can get my story right. So he has seen a lot of horror in real life, and what he did in horror was try to make it subdued and quiet, what he called quiet horror, because he didn't want to gross people out. He did not like the splatterpunk movement. He liked stories that let the reader gross yourself out, not gross out the reader from the words directly. But he was another smoker.
Yeah.
And
might be one of the reasons why we lost him, huh?
Yeah, probably the reason we lost him was because he was a heavy smoker, and he was very prolific. I think he had like 6 or 7 pen names that he wrote under, and he churned out 2 or 3 books a year easily back in the 80s and 90s.
Him and Maltzberg with all the pen names. George A. Romero.
George Romero was another what I call truck driver personality. Stephen King. I did one interview for Fangoria where I interviewed George Romero and Stephen King together. Again, a rare instance where I was able to get them in a bar. This was so fun. I'm not a drinker. I'm basically a teetotaler. I'm more of a soda junkie than anything else. But I found that the best interviews were always done in bars, not going to a panel, not meeting them in a hotel room. But if you didn't mind the background noise, just getting them in the corner or a private room of a bar at the convention was the best place to conduct an interview. So that's where I did George and Stephen. And again, they were like two truck drivers who said, "Wait a minute, we grew up watching, reading EC comics. Let's do a movie called Creep Show, where we get to live out our childhood fantasies of writing and directing a movie based on EC comics." So George took everything in stride. He was a working stiff, never thought too much of himself, just as Stephen King is. If in spite of his incredible fame and fortune, Stephen King is the type of guy, if you didn't know was the Stephen King, uh, you would just think this is just a working stiff, wears glasses, big guy, uh, you know, doesn't say much in public unless someone recognizes him as the Stephen King. There was one instance where we were at a bar, and this was before he had his intervention and stopped drinking. But we were at a bar at a convention, as we were always at the bar to do the interviews. And when he signed for the check for our drinks, the waitress looked at the signature for his room, and it said Stephen King, and she says, "Are you the Stephen King?" And he kind of shrugged, and he says, "Yeah, I kind of guess I am."
I
And
gotta guess I am. You're right.
what are you
Um,
gonna do? There's the Stephen King.
Dennis Etchison, another Harlan Ellison-esque personality.
Yeah, yeah. Dennis was a he was a live wire, but he was
I
another
booked
guy
him
who
for
didn't.
one of his last events, by the way. So down here
Yeah,
in San Diego. So I'm very familiar with his personality, but very nice.
prickly human. I'll just say he's a prickly human being. Does I still don't think another. You mentioned David Morrell being underrated. Dennis Etchison's another underrated writer. I remember his first collection of short stories, The Dark Country, and he told me that the reason he called it The Dark Country was because of Ray Bradbury, and he took the October Country and Dark Carnival and blended the two titles together to make it The Dark Country.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
he was not satisfied with the interview. He was one of the very few writers. Most of the writers I've interviewed, and I've interviewed hundreds of people in my career, they simply trusted me, and they said, "Stanley," I would always offer them, always say, would you like to see the interview before it goes to print? So you can take things in, take things out, put things in. 9 times out of 10, people say, "Stanley, I trust you. You do what you want with it." But Dennis was like, I got to look at it. I got to edit it. I got to change it. I got to do this. I got to modify, this word. I could have used a better word or a better phrasing here. And but that was Dennis. There was nothing wrong with the interview. It's just that ultimately he just wanted to tinker with it, and I think it ultimately appeared in Twilight Zone magazine.
Yeah.
Plus, of course, Dark Dreamers.
Yeah, I moderated a panel that he spoke on for at the Horrible Imaginings Film Fest in San Diego that I think might have been his last public appearance, and he was great, did a great job. But yeah, I mean, I had met Dennis before, so I knew how prickly he was. But
Yeah.
I kind of appreciate that of him. Let's see, David Cronenberg is a big one. That
Another
was
rare telephone interview. Did not have the opportunity to meet with him on set. I wish I had, but just very formal. This was early in his career. I think he had only done 4 or 5 movies at this time, and this was just about same time the first book of criticism of Cronenberg came out, I believe, called The Shape of Rage, an examination of his movies. And that, again, this was at the time he'd only had done 4 or 5 movies, but he already had, at that time, a cult following for his movies. But again, very formal, very polite, very nice.
Anne Rice.
Anne Rice was another person, unfortunately, I did not meet in person, but again, very sweet, uh, but a bit of a loner in the sense that she did not consider herself, and I'll use this in quotes, one of the boys. She did not consider herself part of any movement or any group of writers. She was Anne Rice. She felt she was a genre unto herself, did not go to conventions, did not go to conferences, at least none that I was aware of at the time I was conducting the interviews.
All right, I got 2 left on my list that I'm interested in. Wes Craven.
Wes Craven was very nice. Met him in his office, met him on the set of, believe it or not, his one non-horror movie, Music from the Heart, I believe was the title, that was shot in New York with Meryl Streep, if memory serves.
Yep.
So I remember going to see him on set, and the set just happened to be Carnegie Hall, and Isaac Perlman was in performance and being filmed for the movie, Music from the Heart. So
Yeah.
just a super sweet guy. I ended up writing a book about him, which, for again, long story short, never got legally published to my knowledge. It was accepted by a publisher, was scheduled by a publisher, and then kind of disappeared, or the publisher disappeared and never saw the light of day. But Wes was another person who, very low key, was just humbled by the fact that people thought he was such a great director. He did not think he was a great director. He just said, I'm a working stiff, doing the best I can every day.
Yeah, and I think my last lightning round is Whitley Strieber.
Oh, Whitley. Oh my God. Oh, Whitley. He's still with us.
Yes.
Whitley's one of a kind. I did 2 interviews with him for Twilight Zone magazine, 2 of my best. Dean Koontz even wrote me a fan letter about the Whitley Strieber interviews because he was so blown away from them. I did 1 interview with Whitley before the communion experience, and Whitley was the most haunted person I met. Very skittish, very nervous type personality. And then I interviewed him after Communion became a New York Times #1 bestseller, and he was a totally different personality. Uh, Very confident, still haunted, but haunted in a different way because, of course, the Communion experience had happened to him, and I was a sympathetic ear. A lot of people in the horror community and science fiction community disowned Whitley because of his success as a fiction writer. They said you're just cashing in on flying saucers and alien abductions, and you're full of shit. To make a perfectly blunt point about it. And when I spoke with Whitley for the second time after the communion experience, he knew that he had a sympathetic ear, so he was very open to me. And those 2 interviews, which I melded together in the book, Dark Dreamers, I consider amongst my finest because uh, I was willing to listen to Whitley about being abducted by uh, alien visitors, and at a time when not everybody would give him the time of day.
Well, and I think it's curious. Like I heard it's when his wife passed away, and they had turned this into like a very big industry here in the last couple years. And then when she passed away, he wrote another horror novel, and I heard him on a horror podcast, and he was very like he only wanted to talk about his horror novel, right? and he did not want to bring up the other stuff. And I thought maybe it had so much to do with, him losing his wife. I'm not sure, but I find him to be a very fascinating person.
Yes.
And one of the reasons why I waited till last to ask you is because I agree. You did a great interview with him. And it's interesting that Dean Koontz dropped you a line on that. Because, and I probably should have asked you about Koontz because he's an interesting guy. I'm not personally a fan of Koontz's work. However, I think Intensity is incredible.
Okay.
Yeah. And, but I appreciate everything that he's done. And I keep meaning to read his early science fiction because I think that's the lane that I will enjoy. Um, but I haven't gotten around to it. I have Dark Symphony sitting on the shelf back there. I'm gonna get to it eventually. But yeah, I think the Whitley Strieber one is a really important interview, and that's why I waited till last. to ask.
One thing I'm proud of is that a lot of authors have official websites. And over the years, I've been told that my interview with a certain person was the best interview they've ever sat for. And
Yeah.
if you go to their website, haven't lately, but if you go to the Rick McCammon website, I'm told that my interview with Robert McCammon is there as the example of a good interview with Robert McCammon. If you go to the Graham Masterton website, I'm told that my interview with Graham Masterton is considered the best interview with Graham Masterton. If you go to the TV series Dark Dreamers, and there are various episodes up on YouTube, if you go to the interview with Harlan Ellison, Harlan Ellison told me that the one that he did with me was one of the best interviews he had ever done in his career.
Well, it's
And
not
I
like he
said,
was a tough critic or anything.
no,
So
he wasn't. And he said, as long as you pay me my $1,000 speaking fee, I'll give you the best interview you've ever had. And I
I'm
said,
obviously being sarcastic about him not being a tough critic because he was.
oh no, he was a softie. It was Susan. Susan was the boss of that relationship. People have it all twisted around. Susan led him on a leash, but it was invisible. Nobody saw it except a very few people. But I'll tell you a quick story about Harlan when we went to his home for the day to film our episode. Because again, most people who are not in the industry don't realize that half hour. The Dark Dreamers was a half-hour show that ran from 2000 to 2001, and most people are not aware that it takes hours and hours and hours to conduct an interview for television, and then you whittle it down to 15 minutes or 10 minutes or an hour or 23 minutes as our show was without the commercials. But we went to his home, and Susan was there, and Susan was leaving, and he said, Susan's not going to be here, so you're just going to have me to deal with the whole day. And I said, well, that's fine. And he said, well, she's off to do Pilates. And this is back in the year 2000.
Right.
And I said, oh, okay. And he says, yeah. He says, you know what Pilates are, don't you? And I said, sure, Harlan. I just had two for breakfast. And his jaw dropped. He didn't know what he was so ready to say, you're dealing with Harlan Ellison for the day. And I go, no, you're dealing with Stan Wiater for the day. And we had
Well,
a wonderful time.
yeah, and I gotta say, like, for me, picking your brain and doing this is really exciting for me because I think now that podcasts are a thing and long form interviews are common and they're, have you thought about releasing some of the unedited Dark Dreamers? I don't know. I haven't looked to see if you've done that already, but because now there's an appetite for these types of long form interviews.
I have thought of it, but I'm more or less retired for health reasons.
Yeah.
So as much as I'm, believe it or not, planning to I'm starting research on doing my memoirs because enough people have been bugging about it. I'm just trying to find the right publisher. I also want to put out one more book of my collected short stories. Uh, I
Nice.
basically, to be perfectly blunt, I sold my archives a few years ago, and the archives had all the raw tapes, both audio and video.
Hmm.
Uh, so again, um, I'm a
And
working student.
where are they archived? Because that's
I sold them to a book dealer.
oh, okay. All right.
If I had given them to a university, I would have gotten a nice tax credit, or I could have sold them to a rare book dealer who will remain nameless and picked
It's
up a
up to
nice piece of
them.
change.
Yeah. Well, and the University of Pittsburgh is trying to position itself as the ultimate horror archive. And I say that because I know my friend Lisa Morton, she former president of the HWA, she just recently started moving her papers there and willing her papers there. And horror writers should think about that because they're now doing digital archives as well. So, you know, um, they're they're starting to archive like the different drafts that people write digitally and things like that. And so, and speaking of somebody who digs in the archives and loves digging in the archives, um, you just have no idea. And literally, last year I did one. I started. I haven't published it yet, but I worked on an article about DC Fontana, who wrote for Star Trek,
Yes.
and it's hilarious to me because I went there for DC Fontana, but I found all kinds of different stuff in the Star Trek archives, and you never know what you're going to find. And some of the things are just hilarious. But like one of the best things I found was 16 pages of notes to Norman Spinrad on the Doomsday Machine. And to this day, one of the funniest things I've ever read in an archive is where they told him in the notes, "Hey, you wrote that everybody got their tricorders out. We only have two, so you can only write two tricorders." And
Into your script. Yeah.
it cracked me up. But it's funny, but the reason I say this is these archives can get us nuggets and little important things, and people should take seriously archiving their work. Um,
And I
and yeah,
have. I mean, there. If you go on the internet, and I mean you rhetorically, you'll find the auction that there were two separate auctions that
mhm.
or the Stanley Wiater. It was called the Stanley Wiater Archive of Modern Horror, quote unquote, and it was over 100 boxes of materials,
Well,
bankers boxes of material.
I hope that bookseller considers doing some public things with that. I certainly don't begrudge you for making the choice that you did. I think as long as the stuff stays around and is eventually available for people to find, that's the most important thing to me.
Thank you.
And one
My,
of the
my
most
dream, my dream is I'll win the lottery someday, and I'll buy back the archive if it's still intact, and then I will donate it to the University of Pittsburgh.
well, but we have these, and that is the most
Yeah,
important thing. We also have
and they're ebooks.
yep, yep, and
They're ebooks now, David.
yeah, and people can find them, and they're really really important documents and archives. Just like looking at today, I just seeing like Joe Lansdale being interviewed at that point in his career, for just pulling one example out, it's really valuable and important stuff. But for me, like speaking to your name was very important to me because like that book sat on my toilet for years, so like I saw your name often. And your role is archiving these people to me, like you're a hero to me. And that's you know uh my current role as a columnist for Amazing Stories. I'm writing a little bit more about the history of science fiction. But for me, like getting this stuff out in the internet age where I want people to know who Tony Boucher was, I want people to know who Catherine Lucille Moore was, especially because I'm a Hoosier and she's from Indiana.
Yeah.
Um, By the way, her dorm she lived in college is literally a 5-minute walk from the house I grew up in. So,
Wow. Wow.
um, and I didn't discover that till last year when we did the episode on Chambleau on this podcast. Um, but part of the things we do with the podcast is to cover this history, and I do the sci-fi here, and Stanley, you for years covered horror, but there's a lane out there for somebody young and full of energy who wants to do something like this, to be inspired by your work and become the horror archivist, become the person that does this history. Um, my lane is mostly Philip K. Dick and John Brunner and New Wave, Golden Age, all that. I'm just putting it out there, horror folks. Somebody can be the next generation that does this. We need more work like Dark Visions and Dark Dreamers to keep the history alive, because, well, Stanley caught Joe Lansdale as he was coming up. Somebody else out there can catch the next voice as they're coming up. And I just want to again state what a major impact these books had on me, and for better or for worse. But Stanley, so so you're going to be working on your memoir next? That's the next thing?
That's probably the next thing. I right now, I'm waiting publication of the book of photographs that Beth Gwynn and I did 25 years ago, called Dark Dreamers Facing the Masters of Fear. You may be familiar with it. It was
Yep.
published by Cemetery Dance and it won the Bram Stoker Award for best
Well
nonfiction
deserved.
of that year. And we're putting out that as an ebook and trade paperback later this year. So
Nice.
that's, you can say that's a project that's going to be next on the horizon. I do want to, it was one weird thing about it. The publisher asked me to put death dates of the people who have been deceased since the book was published.
Ooh.
And out of the 100 or so people in the book, nearly 40 have passed on. And it's kind of weird talking about Dennis Etchison, he's in the book, and Charles Grant, he's in the book, and Jack Ketchum, and he's in the book. And these are people who love to smoke and love to drink, and it's unfortunate that they had those bad habits.
There's a similar book, The Faces of Science Fiction, right? And I had a friend who was a bookseller in Canada, Robert Garfat. He owned Dark Horse Books in Victoria, Canada, and he sent me this copy because he was working through getting it signed. And he sent it to me. He said, "David, keep trying to get the signatures in this book." And Robert was he was almost passed away too. And I said, "Robert, I think a lot of these people are already gone. There's not many more, to get." And
Yeah.
we had like kind of a sad moment of talking about it, but it's uh, I think these books, these pictures, these faces, it's important to remember the people that were a part of the genre, and that's the work you do as a historian. And I think it's important to say that I like to think of us as historians as well as columnists and
Yes.
commentators and interviewers, but this was a huge honor, Stanley, to have you here on my podcast, because and it's something I have literally on my dream guest list. You've been there for a long time, and it was just a couple weeks ago I just said to myself, you had posted something and I said, now's the time. I'm going to reach out to Stanley, and I'm glad we were able to make it possible. Is there anything else you want to say to the horror community that's out there, like with this opportunity, like the next generation working on archiving and doing the history of all this?
Just basically that horror has always been with us. It is with us now. It always will be with us as a pop culture and a phenomenon, as a genre. Horror has been successful in the past, especially in film. It was popular in the 80s, it was popular in the 90s. And guess what? Horror films are more popular than ever. And Stephen King is still the number one best-selling horror writer on the planet and probably in history. So my idea is
Of any genre,
of
probably.
any probably of any genre. So as I say on the television show, which as I say, most of it is available on YouTube, and you can purchase the actual 2 seasons worth of DVD on Amazon or Barnes and Noble. Uh, is to enjoy the light, you must first explore the heart and soul of the darkness. And as Jack Ketchum once famously said, the dark is my church. And I happen to be a very religious fellow.
That's awesome. All right, Stanley, how can folks find you if they want to find your work? Where's the best place?
Best place is to go to Amazon.com or go to Google. Either way, there'll be links on where to purchase my books, my DVDs, my CDs, my all my stuff in the wonderful Stanley Wiater multiverse. It's out there, folks, and I'm still alive and kicking, at least as of today.
Stanley, again, I appreciate all the work that you've done. You're a huge inspiration to me. Um, uh, and it's quite an honor to have you on this here podcast. But I'm probably going to ask you to come back at some point, and maybe be a panelist, because we are covering the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, and I could see you doing a great job on some of those episodes if you are so inclined. But
Consider me leaning.
yeah,
I am
and
inclined.
I owe you a debt of gratitude I don't know that I can repay. So I appreciate your time, and I hope everyone who doesn't already have your work runs out and gets it and supports your work. So um, and uh, um, and I don't know, when did you move to Oregon, by the way? Like, when did you do?
2 years ago.
Oh, okay, so we weren't there at the same time. So
Yeah,
I
just two
can't
years.
feel bad that I didn't see you when I was up there.
We will someday. We will meet. I may even go to StokerCon this year. So
Oh, well, yeah, let's connect if you do. And we're we're doing events each month, countdown to StokerCon here in San Diego. So for folks who made it this far listening, keep your eye out. The next one is at Mysterious Galaxy Bookstore, February 10th. So we just had the first one Friday night, and it was a great success. There was a lot of people out, trying to make sure we fill that dealer room with lots of locals. Um, uh, so we're trying to program ahead of time. So on that note, folks, if you made it this far, you're awesome. Stanley, go buy his books, and we'll see you next time on Postcards from a Dying World. I think the next episode is actually covering Lester Del Rey's Helen O'Loy for the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series. That should be the next episode. If not, then it'll be like 2 down. But I've already got that panel booked, and I got a robotics expert. And I might not have needed one for a story that old about robots, but we'll see. We'll see how it turns out. Thanks, folks, for joining me. And we'll see Stanley again someday, hopefully soon. Thanks for joining
we
us.
will.